Okay, awesome. So we are going to move through a lot of Facebook's React documentation, but as I said, we're kind of doing our own spin on it. And it's going to be a bit more workshop style, especially for there's some overlap with what we covered yesterday that we're going to do as review. And for that part, I'll be asking folks questions on how to do stuff and kind of letting you folks be the navigator, so to speak, and I'll be the driver. And then as we then start to get into some newer things or reinforce stuff more, I'll kind of take the lead. And I think what'll be good for this beginning part is for us to program along. But I think a good way to do it will be like, I will code a little bit and then you folks can code a little bit and catch up. If you want, there's a link in Zoom to this. It's all in very small chunks, which is why that will work well. And just over here, you can see a little bit of a preview of what we're looking at. Again, a lot of this I know we touched on yesterday, so it'll be a bit of a refresher and a chance for us also just to reinforce it and go a bit deeper. Again, don't follow the code here too much. It's all using class-based React components. And that might actually be a great moment to talk about this very briefly, as long as we're looking at this, because it came up and I know it can be super confusing. And it is one of the confusing and annoying things about React. So this should look familiar to people as a React component from yesterday. Is that the case? Can I get a couple confirmations? Cool. Yeah. So we call this a functional component because we're using a JavaScript function to create a React component. In this case, it's called welcome. And honestly, I think in a lot of ways, this is the coolest part about React. We can use a normal function. We pass it normal argument. We do have this JSX syntax here, which is a little bit of magic, very similar in a lot of ways to Django templates, where we can write something very much like HTML inside our React components, and we just have to make sure to name our files .jsx. And then React will do the work of sort of turning this into a React component. And kind of as it says here, this function is a valid React component because it accepts props and returns a React element. And function is a React component because it accepts an argument named props, is usually an object, a JS object. And let's see, I really like their language, and returns a React element. And it's a normal JS function. Class component is defined using a JS class. And we can see that here. And we do have to use this extends behavior. And I'm not going to go too deep into class components right now, but as long as here, I figured it would be good for us to see. And it has a method called render. And so the key thing here is this sentence right here that says the above two components are equivalent from React's point of view. And if we look at this render method here, it looks awfully similar to what we have up here. And again, I don't want to dig too much into class components at the time, but I just wanted to point it out and illustrate the difference between the two. And in many ways, they're interchangeable. And we'll talk about it a bit later, but class components can use more of the React lifecycle. And functional components are preferred. For now, please start here. Let me go ahead and pop open another tab so I can follow along with my notes. So just to quickly touch on like what the difference between the two are. Let's go ahead now. Let's start a React project. I know we were doing that with Vita, and can someone remind me how to do that? I'm just going to kind of start in the upper left corner of the grid and work through. So Rexford, if I want to create a new project called like my project, how do I do that with Vita for React?
I can tell you how to do it with like the normal npx create React app and then the app name.
It's very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, with Vita, we're just going to, I believe, do something like,
I think it's npm create invite and then
yep,
an option.
yep, and it very well might. I actually don't know how we pronounce this. It might be Vite. I don't know why I went to Vita. I don't know which one is correct.
It's V.
I think it's just V.
V.
Like feet with a V.
Thank you. Interesting. It doesn't want to let me.
Yeah, the homepage for this project has like a whole paragraph where they explain the pronunciation. I guess it's a common question.
That's bizarre that it's not letting me change the project name here. The main thing though is that, so yeah, we can run npm create v, and I'm going to select React as the framework that we use. So we just want normal React. The -ts here is for TypeScript, which is sort of a language built on JavaScript by Microsoft that's very similar in a lot of ways to Python. It's in that it's object oriented. It has some major differences too. But so we go ahead and select React. They've annoyingly kind of named it Vite project for me, and they give me a couple instructions to do here. So I'm going to navigate into the Vite, into my new project, like they said. And take a look at what's there. And there's a bunch of different things here. Dan Reither, just moving through the grid. So the next thing that they tell me to do here is run this command npm install. What is that going to do?
I think that it installs the not sure, but it installs your React components into that specific directory.
Close. It's not installing React components. It is going to install like various JavaScript libraries for us, and it will install them into this directory. It's a lot like the pip command, like the same way that we did pip install Django. We could do npm install. So Express is a backend web framework. similar to that. So we could, and these are all different, in JavaScript, we call them modules or NPM modules. And we can go and check out on their website. And this is and thank you, Dan, and thank you, Rexford. An advanced thank you to folks as I'm kind of asking folks questions as we move through this. And just to kind of review this a little quick, I think React is in fact a library here. So this is like the online phone book, address book of various JavaScript frameworks and packages. And I didn't want to look at NPM, I wanted to look at React. And it's sort of like, yeah, just keeps track of where they live. Like the code here actually lives on the GitHub page for React. But NPM, which I believe stands for node something module. I'm blanking on the P.
So it's commonly understood to mean node package manager. I think
Thank you.
technically it's not an acronym though. It's just 3 letters, which is why every time you refresh the page, there's a different acronym in the top left corner.
Thank you. Yeah, node package manager, not. And they've got that. Yeah, that's cute. That's cute. So you can find also, so again, you know, Python has its own version of this. If you need to look up a node package, this is where we would go. As I mentioned, Express is a backend web framework written in JavaScript that uses Node.js. And the same way that we had pip and a certain project structure with Django, we have a certain project structure here. And with NPM, or there's also a tool called Yarn that is very similar that you might see, and they're essentially interchangeable for our purposes. And they both use NPM modules, right? Which again, we're talking about JavaScript libraries, code that other people have written in JavaScript and then put together and published on the web for other people to use in their projects. And for any project with JavaScript, whether it's going to be a React project or something with Node.js that's totally on the back end, when we're working with NPM modules, there will always be a package.json file. And this is sort of like the requirements.txt file from that we would get when we run pip freeze. And when we created a new project using Vite, I hope I got that right, it went and created this for us. And there's a bunch of stuff here. The key thing is here where it says dependencies. And this is a JSON file, so we can see it's you know a JSON object or JavaScript style object, and we can see our project dependencies. These will get installed too. Dev is short for development. Not to go into it too much, but over here are dependencies that we might use to build our project or to run tests, but that we don't need to actually like run the application. So when I run npm install, if I run it by itself, it looks for a package.json file and installs everything here under dependencies, and then I believe also under dev dependencies. And when stuff gets installed, it will create a directory called node_modules and put it there. And let's go ahead and do that now. And this is a good time to follow along if for folks who want to. If you don't want to, if you prefer to just watch, I think that's totally fine. It's really up to you.
It was npm install, or which step are you at now then?
Yep, npm install.
Okay.
Yep, we're just getting a new project going. And then over here, we can see it installed a ton of node modules, which is the annoying thing about node modules. And let's take a look at React, for example, real quick. And what I want to show here is that every node module has its own package.json file that lists its own dependencies of the node modules it needs. And for instance, up here at the top of the package.json, there's a name property. So we know this is the package.json for React. It talks about it, gives us the home page, some other information like that. And then there actually aren't a ton of dependencies. I have no idea what this node module loose-envify does, but apparently it is needed by React. And what ends up happening is like, and if we go over here, we can see that it's been installed and it has its own package.json file. And then if we scroll down here, we can see it has a different dependency and so on and so on. And so that's why, even though for my project, its only immediate dependencies are React and this React DOM package, but then all these other things get installed because React and React DOM have their own dependencies, which have their own dependencies and so on. And it all lives in the node modules directory. And we don't really ever mess with that. We interact with it through npm to install or uninstall things. And in fact, I'm just going back to add stuff to Git. So I'm in the notes and demos repo. So right now I'm just adding the directory that I'm using to Git. And that looks good. It looks like it is not adding the node modules directory, which is what I want. We don't really want to commit node modules to Git, but we do want to commit the package.json file. So I'm going to go back into my project now. And just go ahead and do this. And this is just a habit that I've picked up over time. So that, again, that's just to refresh a bit. And I know we covered that a bit yesterday. Let's see what else we got created over here. We have a source directory, we have a public directory, and we have index.html. And that's kind of the most important file for the moment. This is just an HTML page. And then we have this script tag here that's loading some JavaScript. Normally, this would be a .js file, right? But because we're using React, which has that cool syntax that looks like HTML, which is called JSX, we have to name our files with a .jsx file extension. And because of that, we also have to use a tool like Vite, or Create React App to do a little processing of this so that it knows to go and grab that JSX file and it'll actually turn it into a JavaScript file, and it does all sorts of interesting things. I'm not going to dig into it, but this is the config file for Vite. And we can see that there's a plugin here called React. Vite can be used for things other than React. We won't mess with that too much. And let's go ahead and take a look in the source at this main.jsx file and see what's going on. And it's already built a lot of stuff for us. It's got this React DOM, create root, this app. Before I get too far, actually, I want to run this and make sure that I did stuff successfully and see some kind of hello world message. Again, just moving through the grid. Justin, how do I start up my development server so I can look at our React project?
I think it's like npm run dev,
Let's see if that works.
something like that.
And let me make sure I'm in the right directory.
You have to CD into the project.
Oh, of course. Thank you. So good. note for folks. If you're trying to run your dev server and it doesn't work, that's the first thing to check. Make sure you're in the directory. We specifically have to be in the same directory where the package.json file is. And it looks like this is working, which is awesome. And I'm gonna load this up. We don't need this, and we don't need that, and we want, oh, I just forgot. Beautiful. So this is our site, does all sorts of fancy stuff for us. Looking at the console, there's this little note here, download React dev tools for a better development experience. I do highly recommend this. And in fact, if you haven't done this, I would recommend adding React developer tools as an extension to Chrome. And let me throw that link in the Zoom chat. And we'll see in a little bit what this can do for us. But yeah, I highly recommend adding React developer tools as an extension to Chrome. Did we look at React developer tools yesterday? I apologize, I was out.
We haven't mentioned it.
Okay, good timing. So we've seen in DevTools, we can look at the HTML elements. Now that I've added React developer tools, there's this tab over here called components that wasn't there. And this lets me look at the React components in my project. And you can look at props, you can look at state. It tells you the source, what file it's coming from. And it lets us interact with it too. There's not a lot here to play with, but we'll see later on that it can do all sorts of great things. And we see that this project has built all sorts of interesting stuff. It's built a button, built some other things, so on and so forth. React developer tools is really good. I highly recommend it. What I want to show real quickly is I want to jump back to our package.json file. And actually I should have asked someone, but my guess is, did we talk about these scripts in here at all yesterday?
I don't think so. They might have been mentioned very briefly. We could
Yeah.
discuss them a little bit.
Yeah, I figured, yeah, we might have touched on them. Yeah, and just to reinforce and reiterate, so these are lists of small programs that we can run using the command line tool npm. Dev, build, preview. And so in that command npm run dev, that's where the dev part came from. I can do npm run build or npm run preview as well. And in this case, we see that they're calling v on the command line. But just as a quick example, actually, sorry, I won't do that. We could write any program we want and run it from here. We could, yeah, I apologize. I'm very tempted to write a small JavaScript program and demo that, but I don't want to get too off course. But mainly I just want to show where that dev command comes from that we use. And I'm going to go get rid of a little bit of stuff here. So I think we want to move back. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. Copy. And paste. And here, let's just get rid of some things that we're not doing. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. We're not even going to do that. I'm gonna start there. Very simple. And it looks like I'm still getting some CSS styles, probably from some caching. And that's okay. Yeah. Just kind of been covering ground that we've been going over. I think, let's see where we want to go next. Yeah, so this is actually where I want to go next. This is what I would like to show us next. It is. There we go. Okay, so let's talk briefly about React components and elements. So this is a React component. It's a function. It doesn't take any arguments right now. What it returns is an element. And we use the JS syntax to help us. But I could do something like this. Let me make sure I get my import statement right. I'm not even sure if I need that, to be honest. Let's do this. So this is kind of the magic of React. Start off with. I think this should look relatively familiar to folks. What I have going on here is I have a function called hello world, a function called app. Hello world is returning a React element, and JSX lets us use this React component, hello world, which is a function. And VS Code even tells us that this function returns, it calls it a JSX element, which is basically a React element. And this is going to be exactly the same as we had a moment ago. What this does under the hood is this. Thing just to do it. Then I believe what I can do is, see, I want to make sure I'm using this correctly. See if that works. And so this is, at this point, the console is your friend too. I probably have to import React. Cool. There we go. So React has, did we look at this yesterday at all, by the way? Cool. Yeah. So this is not like, this is not how we're going to be using React, but I want to get like down to the basis part of it to walk through it. And this is, if anyone is looking in the Facebook docs, it's, I think, section 2, introducing JSX. So we have this library React that Facebook has created, and we've installed it via npm, and it's got all tons of JavaScript code in there. Like if I wanted to, you know, I could go in here and look at it, and God knows what's in there. A lot of code, a lot of code. And we're importing it. And so V does all this kind of work for us. And I'll kind of walk through the pieces of that in a moment. But when we do, let me write the 2 versions of this so that we can see them both side by side. And let me just get this way. So this does the same thing as this. Here, we just are not using JSX to do it. We're using a method called create element. The first argument is the kind of element. The second argument is an object with whatever classes we want to apply to that HTML element. And then the third argument is, I believe it's the text of the element. There might be some other fancier things we could do with it, but that's the basic idea. And if we look in here and we go inside our doc, I can see I have an H1 element. The class name is greeting. It says hello world again. If I change this to H2, see, it's an H2 element now. And this is the method that React uses. When we use JSX like this and like this, under the hood, it's using this method here. Garrett, that's a good question. I'm pretty sure you can add other attributes on the object, but I don't know the details. The main thing I want to emphasize is that under the hood, when we're using JSX, it's using this react.create element method, and the JSX is syntactic sugar, like class name. And here, let me change the names so that the other one will show up. And here, why did that? I think class name should be showing up there. Oh, I know why. I apologize. Over here in this H1, I would need to add it. There we go. And note that when we use JSX, we can't say just class because that's sort of a protected word. We have to use, we can pass in attributes just like with HTML, but it has to be a little different. We get almost everything. A JSX element or a React element is almost like an HTML element, but it does have some differences. And that all that this is doing is calling this create element method, which just takes these arguments And I believe this returns an object. And in fact, I think if we do this, console log hello elements. And if we look in the terminal, so here is our development server running. And if I do a page refresh, oh, maybe it comes up here. Okay. So it's a little messy. It's not quite as clean as I thought. But the main thing here is that our React components render React elements. And then that's kind of what's used to interact with the DOM and change things. And we're not going to work this way, but I did want to show this piece under the hood. And the other thing I wanted to show is you guys have noted I created like app and app2 and stuff. And we have this app.jsx file, and then we have this main.jsx file. And then we have all this stuff here with create root and document.getElement ID and render. And can someone maybe walk me through what's going on here? Like, let's start here at this index.html. Terrence, over here in this index.html file, I've got a div and I've got an ID named root. Why do we have to name that root, and what's special about that for our React application?
I'm pretty sure you have to name it root because it is the root directory. So that's going to be where everything is combined and composed in. And the ID itself refers to the CSS file.
Close. So the ID it's not related to CSS, but you're right that this div with the ID root is that we're going to build our whole React application off of this. And what happens over here, and let me break this into steps so that this is a little easier to read. And then let's do this. This React strict mode, it is a good habit and best practice. We don't really need it for the moment, just to demonstrate. Let me make sure. Oh, maybe I spoke too soon, and maybe we do. Let's see, I'm getting an error.
You got a extra closing parenthesis.
Oh, thank you. Let's see what's happening now.
You're also missing a closing parenthesis on line 9.
Oh, because there's. Yep. Thank you. Let's see if that's working now. Document.getElement by ID is not a function. There's something. Okay, right. I see what's going on and why that didn't work. I'm not gonna get that deep into it.
Yeah, you need to camel case get element by ID.
I think, yeah, I'm honestly, I was confused by that too. I didn't know nothing is camel cased in here. And this is what V rendered. I think.
Mine is camel cased.
Yeah, capital
is.
E, capital B, capital I should be.
Yeah. What on earth happened here? That's really interesting because I did not modify this. Let me see something real quick. I apologize. No, you folks are totally right. I don't know how I did that. So here's, I guess this is a nice little, it's not React, but so because I'm checking my project into Git, I can use it to see what's changed with Git status. And then specifically, I want to see what's changed with that main.jsx file. So I can do Git, the term is diff, and the file in question, and I can see what's happened here. And somehow, I don't know how, I totally did mess this up, and Raphael and folks think you were right, and which makes sense that this stuff should be properly named and camel cased, because these are the actual names of the methods that we're using. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to check out the file that has changed. And that's going to get rid of the changes and load the version of the file that Git has stored. And now if I go back here, I feel like I'm losing. Let's try this again. Okay, well, whatever was happening there, we now have this back and it should be in a good working state. Yeah, let's try that again. Let's see here. Let's get rid of strict mode and make sure that that works. Awesome. Then here, now let's try adding in the element. Expected token.
I think there's a parenthesis missing, maybe. Another closing parenthesis for that statement. After element.
Thank you. Element.render is not a function.
You put the closing parentheses at the end, but you have to put it after element before the period.
Oh. Okay. Got it. Thank you so much. Yeah, the create root method.
I got a little bit
with.
lost there. What are you trying to show to us exactly?
Yeah, I apologize. I did get a little bit lost doing this. I just wanted to break down what's going on here and how we connect our JavaScript code to the HTML file for React. And to walk through that, what happens is, and let's change this ID from root to my React app root. And then over here, let's change this to my React app. So I guess really what I wanted to demonstrate was what this main.jsx file does is we need to tell it like what DOM node, a div, for example, we are going to use as the root to build our React app, to then have all those React elements get rendered into HTML on the DOM in that tree. And that's why we add an ID attribute to this div, so that it's easy to find in our code here in main.jsx, where we can use document.getElement by ID. And then I got a little lost in breaking this down, but what I wanted to, where I was going and just wanted to say is that we then use this library called React DOM, which is for rendering React to the DOM for the browser. And we tell it, we need to create the root of our React project on this element. And then on that, we want to go ahead and render this React component And this is, we'll call this often like the entry point to our application, because this is the very first component that gets rendered. So that was a very long-winded route for getting there, and I apologize, but that's kind of what I wanted to walk through a bit and break those pieces down to show what we have going on here, because we have index.html, where we have to identify the HTML element that we're going to build our React app off of. And then we have the script tag that loads that JavaScript. And then this main.jsx file is what gets run. So that's what we have in the script tag here. And when this runs, it loads React, it loads React DOM, it imports this app React component. We don't really need that CSS. We grab the HTML element that we want to use as the root for our application. And then we tell React DOM, this is going to be the root, and go ahead and render our application and build it off of there. So I just want to check in. I know there's not a lot of stuff here. We could add a couple things here. Like if I did, like I could do this. This is not part of my React app. It's in the HTML file. This 2 is in the HTML. And so we can see in terms of HTML, everything gets rendered like this, right? It all gets turned into HTML. And we can see here's that div, and inside that our app is built. And right now our app is pretty simple. It's not anything nested. If we look in React, we can see it has these two components from React's perspective, the app component, and then a child component called Hello World. And then we can see here's the other part of our HTML page. And if I move this around and put this at the top, then we'd have our React app up here, and then this is some HTML. So I just kind of wanted to illustrate the different pieces and how we connect our React application to the HTML page. And now is, I think, a good time to pause and check in and see if there are questions or comments that folks have, because I know I did digress a little, and then it's probably also a good time for a short break. So yeah, before we break, what's on people's minds? And I know this is a lot of stuff, so please let me know, like, and I got a little in the weeds, like, is this confusing? Is this a bit too much? Is this useful, but it's maybe like, why are we looking at this? How are people feeling, and what are people thinking about right now?
I'd say it was a lot like what we learned yesterday, just a little bit more in depth.
Cool. Yeah, what else is on people's minds?
Hey, Adam, down in the dev tools, I see you're able to access those React components in the React profiler. Is that how like I'm in my dev tools, I don't see it. Is that some specific setting that you had to?
It is. Yeah, if you just Google like React DevTools Chrome extension.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you'll find it. It's called React Developer Tools.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep, for sure. I'll throw it in the Zoom chat. Yeah, and that's pretty standard. I pretty much everyone working it. I don't want to say everyone, but a lot of people, working with React will use that. And I think it's super useful, especially as stuff gets more complex. It lets us like add props. And actually, or it lets us modify state, excuse me. And like I can open up and inspect and look at the HTML itself if I need to. So it's good. Yeah, what other questions or thoughts do people have?
Adam, I have a question.
Yes, sir, Jacob.
I know this is everything that you pretty much just went over. I'm just having a hard time like grasping the hierarchy kind of like how the page renders is index.html like the kind of starting point, and then like
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
and yeah, and in fact, like to walk through this, and it's tricky because so to walk through what happens here, the browser loads our page. It's going to load all the HTML. Then it gets to the script tag. And the key thing is we do have to have the div that we're going to use as the root of our React app before the script tag. Because if I do this, I'm actually surprised I didn't get an error. Okay, I was wrong about that. I apologize. I thought that actually would error, but I think React DOM must be smart enough to wait for the page to finish loading. So the main thing is the HTML loads, and then it executes this JavaScript. So we start with index.html, and then we have this main.jsx file. And really the only thing we want to do here is attach our React app to the HTML. And we do that in these 2 lines of code where we grab the HTML element that we're going to build our app off of here on line 5. And then on line 6, we use this tool React DOM, which will render React to the DOM for browsers. And we tell it, hey, for this specific DOM element, go ahead and render this React component. And just by convention, we usually we call it the top level component app. And I have a bunch of stuff in here because I was showing different examples. But this is a very straightforward. And in fact, let's go ahead and.
So it kind of just goes from index.html to main.jsx and then app.jsx.
Yeah,
Does that sound right?
that is exactly right.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and just to show that nesting a little more too, let me go ahead and grab this hello world. And let's pull it out of here and put it in here. Something like that. See, we don't want that. And then let's bring this up to the top since this is what we care about. And I'll just move this down here and we'll worry about that stuff later. Import hello world. Now in app.jsx, what I've done is I moved that bit of code that just is rendering an H1 into its own file. And it's just a normal JavaScript function, except it's got this JSX syntax, and we export it, and then we import and use it here. So you can see how we can start to build up our structure. But Jacob, you're correct that everything starts with index.html. Main.jsx is how we connect the JavaScript to the HTML. And then by convention, we will have a component named app.jsx. That's our top level component. That's our entry point. And then just to pop back over and look at this, we can see the rendered HTML here, and then we can see our 2 components over here.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, really good question. I think it's really helpful. I know I'm covering some stuff that we already looked at. I just think it's really helpful to lock as much of this down before we start kind of building on top of it. So yeah, before we break, any other thoughts, questions that people have?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so this should be really quick. Is it a convention to have just one main app, or do we ever get to the point where we have multiple apps that we're pulling in?
That's a great question. You mean sort of like with a Django project? how it, whether it
Well-
would be, or just,
I just meant like, so in the main, you know how we have
I
in the
see.
render we have just
Mhm.
yeah, is it ever going to get to the point where we have like, okay, we
Right.
have app and then we've got some other app like app 2, app 3,
right,
or is it convention to just have like one main app?
right. That's a great question. It's a convention, not just a convention, but almost a necessity to have one app. There could, without getting into it, you can have more than one React app on the same page, but that would be a more specialized use case and not what we're looking at here. There are a couple reasons for that. One is that like when we're building a web page, yeah, there's a couple of reasons for that. We wouldn't do it this way, like, yeah, I don't want to get into that because I'm gonna get lost in the weeds. The short answer is there's always going to be one main app, because when we're building like a single page app or we're using React to build a website, just like with HTML, like the whole page is a tree. It all starts off of one point. And with our React app, like everything else is going to be a child of this app component. Like we could have, let's create a new file here. Let's just call it byworld.jsx.
It's kind of grim, don't you think?
Sorry. It is a little melancholic. I just want to demonstrate like sibling components real quick. So we actually will probably need to wrap these in a div. I'm pretty sure this is going to fail. Yeah. Let's do it. Let's just do it. So actually, note how I have this huge squiggly here. The return function doesn't let me return two elements like this. Because just like with HTML, we're forming a tree. Everything has to be inside something else, which is true of the render function as well. So I'm going to put these inside a div just for simplicity. Let me get rid of that. And same over here. Like if I tried to do that, it would complain. And I mean, there's maybe edge cases, but this is sort of what siblings, and I apologize that I'm jumping around a bit. Like this is what sibling components would look like. Note that they're both children of the app component. And if we look here, we see here's the app and here's Hello World and here's Goodbye World. And so to circle back to your question, like as our program gets more complex, we might have siblings, but they're all going to be children of the app component, which is sort of the parent of everything. Did that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Mostly makes sense. Yeah, Luis, good question. Cool. Let's break. Let's come back at 10:10, and we'll dig more into using props and then start looking at state and things like that. Awesome. Thank you, folks. All right. I'm gonna hit resume on the recording, and we're gonna keep on keep on rolling. So I think the next thing to review is props. And we talked a bit about props. I did a bit of restructuring. By the way, I moved all this stuff into one file, and actually, let me go ahead and commit those changes and get. So I always just do git status to see what's going on. Add, this is showing me everything that hasn't been committed to Git that it's not saving. The add command will add it for it to like be ready to be committed, and dot is short for everything. And now if I type git status, it shows me everything that's about to be committed. And now it's all in there and saved. So now for my next time I make a mistake, we have everything in a good state that we can go back to. So yeah, props. We've seen props, and I'm sure we saw them yesterday here. And let me see. Let's see here. Yeah, okay, we don't need to go into React create element with props. But basically, this is a little bit of the magic that JSX does. Like, let's say for hello and goodbye, we wanted to show the weather too. I would do something like this, right? And I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm just going to close that for a moment. And this is, again, the curly brackets sort of indicate our templating. So all this, I think we're going to get, yeah, all this renders just fine. I've updated these components, goodbye world, hello world. Props is an argument to a JavaScript function. We are assuming that it's going to be an object, and this doesn't exist. And I mean, I could add here, if I add console log, hello world, props. Now, if I go to my code, because this JavaScript gets run in the browser, that print statement comes here, and we can see it's just an empty object. If I go to my React Dev Tools, we can see that props is still empty because we haven't done anything. We haven't passed in any props. So we've now updated these components. And if I look at that, you know, if someone else wrote it and I look at it, I would say, okay, I'm expected to pass in an object with a property named weather, and then that's going to get printed out. And as you folks saw the other day, yesterday, the way that we use props is with JSX, it looks similar to HTML element attributes. And now I see that message. you know, printing out the props here in the console log actually doesn't work so great because React, sorry, does a bunch of things to that. In some ways over here is a bit easier because now if I look at either of these components, I can see the props that get passed in. Let's see if that works. Yeah, and that does work. And that's one of the cool things about React DevTools is that I can even modify the props values and then React updates the DOM. And that can be a useful tool for just debugging and working on stuff. And
Can you go
again,
back and show us where you passed in the sunny in your code?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah. And does this look familiar from yesterday? Did we, I'm guessing we looked at props, but I want to confirm.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And this is one of the biggest concepts, to be honest. And I think it's deceptive because it looks like what we're used to with HTML, but it's not. This is actually a function argument. So this is like the big, for me, this is how I think about stuff in React. And I think it's really helpful to think about it. Like this over here, this is a function call. We're calling a function named hello world. It's taking in an argument, these props. It's returning a React element, and React then does the work of rendering that element into the DOM in HTML. And that's why I think writing React code as functional components is helpful, because it gives you a vision that's a bit more accurate of what React is really doing. What we really have here are a bunch of functions, and we pass in some properties, some arguments, props to those functions. And then those functions use that to create a React element that's getting rendered. So it's like we put data in and then something gets rendered on the screen. And that's what React is all about, because it's a user interface library. And its job is to make it easier for us to build user interfaces that are interactive. And it does all this work to do that for us. So like, we don't really create HTML anymore. We don't decide when to update the DOM or update the page. React kind of does all of that for us. And we're just looking at the basics here, but it's extremely powerful. And a prop doesn't have to be a string. I could do this. And if I want to pass in a variable, I would do it like this. Prop can be anything we want. A prop could even be another React component that's actually a certain kind of sort of React design pattern. And now, and this is where things start to get interesting. Because I've got this one variable, I'm passing it into two different components that are now kind of starting to render it. And if I start making changes, I think it gets a little more interesting. And I apologize for the macabre content of this. I honestly wasn't trying to like be dark or funny anything. I just wanted an opposite for demonstration purposes. So we starting to see how we can separate our data and how we render that data with this view. And the same concepts that we talked about, like models and views and templates in Django, we can sort of talk about that with React too. It's like these components, all their job is right now is to render stuff. They're basically like views. So yeah, let me check in. And let me get rid of this because this wasn't so useful. How are people feeling about props? Any questions with what we're doing at the moment?
Yeah, just real quick, if you wanted to, how would you pass in a second prop? Would it be a comma or would you just name it?
That's a great question. With JSX syntax, we do it like HTML element attributes. And what's a good second prop to pass in? What's something kind of germane to the topic? We've got weather. Any suggestions?
I was gonna say you could split weather by like having it, rainy, sunny, or whatever, and then having like an adjective to describe it being really rainy or partly cloudy.
Sure. Let's call it description. So right now, let's see if I get an error. Right, no. So this is a good thing to know. This prop description, it doesn't exist. We're not doing anything with it. I'm pretty sure if I look here in the components, we can see that, and remember, the key thing is that, let me move this over here. And this is something I like to do too. Like I've ordered my files by the flow of data, sort of. We have the index, main, app, and the children. So remember that this is, yeah, that's a really good question. This is how you would pass more than one prop. And like a common way you'll see this written is something like this. Because as it gets longer, this becomes a bit easier to read, at least for me. These are just function arguments, and React is bundling them into an object called props for us. And we get that here. And we're not doing anything with it yet. But like if I console log props.description, I should get that. Yep, this partly right here. And if I click over here, I can look at the source, and in our sources, we can see the actual code. If I wanted to, by the way, I think we can even modify this. It won't persist, but I believe if I add that, oh no, because I'd have to refresh the page. If we had something more interactive, we could see that happen. And then we see here too in the React components that those props, that description prop is being passed in even though we aren't using it yet. Jacob, yes, sir.
Would you mind going back to the code real quick?
Not at all.
On line 7 where it says props dot weather, is the dot weather, like then it goes back to, I think, where was the in app, if you go to app, is it talking about like on line 11, for instance, is it talking about the weather to the left or the right of the?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the syntax here is for a prop, just like kind of with an HTML element, you have the name of the element and its value. Here we have the name or the key of the particular prop and then the value. So what this does, and remember that this builds an object. And I wish that the console log was a little cleaner. I apologize that it's not. Let me see. Let's see exactly what that looks like. So if we can get that working, that would actually be great. Okay, there we go. There it is. Perfect. So just from this goodbye world component here, we're logging this props argument. And we can see that without worrying about the prototype, it's a plain JavaScript object. And it's got two keys, two properties, weather and description. And then each of those has two different values, sunny and partly. And over here, these determine the key and the value. Like I could do another prop name equals this is the prop value. And I need to put it in the goodbye one. Now, if I go over here, check out our props object. That object has another key with the name, another prop name, and then this value, which we can see over here too. Did that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's just like prop dot, and then whatever value we'll need to do prop dot key to.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's, yeah, and that's the dot notation that's JavaScript. Like in JavaScript, let me clear this. This is how you create an object, right? With these two curly brackets. This object doesn't have any properties right now. I could do it like this. I could also create a new property on that object like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot more sense.
For sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's one of the big challenges with web app development and React in particular is that there are a lot of different syntaxes and languages that you have to know because we're working with HTML, with the DOM, with JavaScript, and with React and JSX. Plus, of course, then there's also Python to throw it in the mix just so life doesn't get boring. So there's a lot for sure. And it's really just practice. And that's too why we really kind of wanted to review some of this stuff because so many things look similar, but there are some like deeper differences. Yeah, what other questions do folks have? Okay, cool. I think I want to keep running with this. And what I want to show now is our app component. We might have seen this yesterday too. It's just another React component. And we can give it props as well. And in fact, let's do this. Let's break this up. Let's do that. App root, and then app root dot render. And let me make sure that that works. It does. And now I think it'll make it a little easier. I find it a little easier to read it when I'm about to do this. Rainy description. So just like any other component, our app component just happens to be the first component, the parent of all the others, and we can pass it props. And we're not doing anything with those props yet, but with DevTools, I can look and I confirm that they're there. And now if we want to, instead of defining these here, let's do it like this. We'll start like this. And now we've got props that we set at the top level here in the app that then get passed down into the children. And if I change it here in DevTools, then it changes here. And React does all that work of re-rendering, which is great. So let me check in and see, does this make sense to folks? And do folks have questions about what we just did here? And is there code that would be good to look at again? Yes, sir, Francisco.
Yeah, so I saw that you started passing the new props from the very top. Does that mean that so inside the hello world and the goodbye functions where you're still, I believe you're still calling the props, right? Instead of the goodbye world. Yeah, so you're still calling props.weather. Does that mean, but then if you go back to your app.js, you're also calling props from, I believe the main JSX, right?
Right, yeah, let's walk through this. So in the app, we have these two props, rainy and description. So Francisco, we pass those two props into our app component. So walk me through, at this point in the code, what is this props argument?
So right there is where you're basically grabbing the objects that you have in your main JX, such as weather and description, which would be the keys.
Yep, exactly. And I'm going to do a sort of poor man's React dev tools. Let's clear and refresh. And we can see, let me get rid of the other one so that it's not confusing. So yep, we've got an object here in app, and it's got the key weather and a value and the description, and another key description and another value. And then we pass it into hello world, right? And we are doing the same structure. And Francisco, I want to check in because I want to make sure that I'm answering your question because I kind of ran with it a little bit. So actually, let me just pause and check in with you.
So basically, my question was basically, does that, whatever you did on your app.js, does that basically just override what you're asking for here on your hello world and your goodbye, since props.weather doesn't exist technically in your app.js anymore?
So
in your apps.js, you're already calling props.weather from your main JS. Or is it just being passed down because you named it weather and it's still getting passed as a prop?
It's just being passed down, yeah, because it's the same name. Like, yeah, like here's, yeah, let me make a modification too to make that clear, because I think that's a really good point. Like, let's call this modifier instead of description. Now over here, oh, we're not even using the description and the goodbye. Oh yeah, we haven't even been using these yet. Let's do that. That would probably help. I don't know. Let's see. This is hopefully these. I'm trying to pick some names that I think won't be too confusing. And you raise a good point because I actually forgot that we hadn't done this step. So now we're using that data. And to use DevTools, starting at the top level, let me make this a bit bigger. The two props that get passed into the app component are prop name description and a prop name weather. And they're the values vary and rainy. Then, and remember, this is just a JavaScript object. well, props.weather specifically is a string. And this is another string. And now this hello world and goodbye world component, they have some props of their own. We're not using this one, so I'll get rid of that for now. The prop names are weather and prefix or prefix, like, and the values we're getting from this argument that got passed into app. And it's the same thing over here. And then that's what's actually gets rendered. And we can kind of walk through here. So the data is the same, but we're using different names for the props. So like here, if I console log this, it's going to be another object because that's what React does. It takes props and it bundles them up and passes it as a JavaScript object into the components. But because we changed the prop name, that key is different, but it's the same data. I don't know, did that make sense, Francisco? I think that's kind of what you're asking about. I want to make sure that that kind of that walkthrough of the flow was helpful.
Yeah, that definitely helped. Thank you. I really appreciate it, Adam.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a really good question. And I think that that's one of the trickiest things with React. And that's again why I think it's really helpful to just keep reminding yourself that these are functions in disguise. And we're just passing data into one function that passes it into other functions, that passes it into other functions. Alicia, yes, I know you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to know how often is it that you're actually going to be passing in props to your main app.jsx, because
right,
as far as I understood, app.jsx would basically be like your entire page. So how often do you pass stuff into it directly?
Right, that's a really good question. It is pretty common, actually. You don't do it all the time. A good example might be, so because, like, especially because this is where you kind of do all the setup, like sometimes for authentication reasons, maybe there's like an HTML element in here that contains some data. Or maybe we have to make an Axios call to get some data here. It doesn't always work that way, but sometimes you might have to pass in some kind of like authentication token. Sometimes there are also like very high level settings, like some apps might have like what's called like a development mode, where maybe you get lots of error messages and things like that. And so you might do something like this, but it would be more like false. This is kind of a bad pseudocode, but like this is a common pattern. So those are things where it's like very high level settings for your application you might set up here at the app level, because
Where would it be
difficult to otherwise.
that get if dev mode function? Where would that be coming from?
Right, that would be another imported from another JavaScript file. Like you would like what is pretty common. Yeah, exactly, right, because I had to walk through this. So we import the main file here. A lot of the times this might not be a JSX file, it might be a JS file. No, I take that back. It would probably be a JSX file. It doesn't matter. I was getting lost in the weeds. Like it might be written here, it might be imported from another JavaScript file. there are a couple different ways that we could get it in there. But like what is really common is that, yeah, there are certain settings for the application, whether it's development mode or like maybe an authentication token, that the server that you could inject into your HTML or inject into your JavaScript, and that you want to deal with and pass into here, and that you kind of need to do that before you start the React app. I'm sorry, I know that's a little vague. It's both because I don't want to get too in the weeds, and also because it's been a minute since I've like worked with that code directly, so I'm not having a hard time describing the pattern. But essentially, you might do certain things here with data that like you have injected during the build process.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and the answer kind of like opens up some bigger things. I think the main takeaway actually, and I think the way to kind of really answer your question well, is so here we ran this command, npm run dev, right? And that starts up our application for development mode. But I believe it's called build, in fact. Yeah, so there's a build command. So for production, we would want to minify this code, and we're not going to like use our own computer to serve it up to the internet. We're going to send it, to our server in the cloud that's going to be hosting all of it. So we would run this build command, and maybe like we would pass some command line arguments like dev mode equals false. We wouldn't even do this manually. There would be another tool that does this for us. But something like this. And then there are certain ways that we could inject those in here. That's also why I don't want to get too in the weeds with it, because I'll start. It's things I haven't looked at in a minute, and also that touch on things that we haven't looked at yet. But yeah, that's a good question. And in terms of the apps that we're building, we don't really need to do this right now. But and the main reason I wanted to demonstrate this now was first just to emphasize that app is just any other React component, and to see that kind of like component nesting with children and like passing props through multiple levels, because that is something that's very common. So yeah, that was a really good question. What other questions do people have? Okay, cool. It's 10:45. How are people feeling? Should we do a short break and then pick it up? Yeah, I'm actually gonna make the call. Let's do that. Let's take a short break. We'll come back at 10:50. So take a 6-minute break, because there's a lot of talking today. So breaks are good. All right, folks, thank you. And I'll see everyone at 10:50. So I think the first thing I want to do is, let's see here. So we're not even going to work.
By the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Alicia. Yeah, that's a super important step. So we're not even going to worry about, let me close that out. There we go. We're not even going to worry about our React app for a minute. We're just going to build a little simulation of sort of getting some weather information. And let's do this. Let weather equal I'm just going to start with, I'm getting a little lost, so I'm just going to see that. Okay.
So it looks like you're putting this in your main.jsx.
That is
So
correct.
that's kind of the reason for that.
Yeah, this is just this. I'm just going to kind of build it up in pieces. And it's going to connect it to React in a minute. And we're going to kind of see it here to see sort of how React does rendering, and we can see it with props, and then we're going to move it into state, and it'll be all inside the application.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and the example I wanted to do was just, let's see here. Oh yeah, we need a console log. Yeah, okay. Let's just do it this way. What am I doing wrong here? I apologize. I'm getting a little lost in the mix. Oh yeah, let's do this. I'm just going to and then sorry, I apologize. I thought I kind of had this doing what I wanted, but it's not quite there. I feel like this should be
Do
running.
you not have to put that, and maybe I'm getting, do you not have to put that in your app.approot.render? Or I guess just because you're console logging, that's why you don't have to.
I was hoping to just get a console log, yeah. But there's something that I'm not doing right here that's not making it work.
You have to put let time equal new date.
You know, we should, but we don't have to. That's not the issue. Let me quickly, I apologize for the digression. Let me quickly, I'm doing something wrong with the JavaScript set interval method. So let me just go ahead and copy an example. Let's see, set interval callback 500. And it, in fact, could be yep, there we go. I had the arguments backwards, so I apologize about that. I was losing my mind. I was like, how come nothing is happening? But that's all I wanted to get going. Just so we don't even have this in our React code, right? I just wanted to show that, you know, we're using this sort of built-in function that the browser gives us, or that JavaScript gives us, set interval to get, and then to call this function, and it prints out the time. Does this make sense to folks? This, because I want to check in, because this is important too, if people feel good about just how this bit of code is working at the moment. And what we're going to do next is kind of plug it into our React app. So just to walk through, set interval says, give me a function that I should execute and tell me what interval of milliseconds I should wait before executing it. So we call this get time method every 1,000 milliseconds, every second. And then in here, we're using the JavaScript date method to get a date and printing it out. And we should really return it too, because that's going to be, we're going to need that in a minute. But let's see, what I want to do is, we're not going to really worry about formatting it. We only really care about the time. What we're going to do is pass in as a third argument here, current time equals, and now here's where it's going to get a little funny just for a minute. Let's do it like this. Yes, we don't really even need to return it here. So I think that's working. Yep. So I know this is a little strange, and in fact, I'll just leave that. This sort of simulates like if we had to call a third API for some reason to get some data for the current time. I don't, again, this is sort of a made up example. And we're going to move it inside the app in just a moment. But I wanted to use this to demonstrate what I'm going to show in a minute, which is how React handles updates. And right now, nothing is happening to our app too, which is important to note. Like we've created this prop that we pass in, but we're not doing anything with it. And I don't believe any of this is getting re-rendered by React. It might be. We could check. We could over here. Let's do this. Console.log time is props.time. Now we might start seeing current time. Yeah. So we can't really tell, but right now I believe React is constantly re-rendering our application because this prop is changing. And to make that a little more interesting, let's do this. I'll just make this an H1.
You have it stop current time.
Oh yeah. Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, that's another, we haven't really looked at like prop types, but there are a lot of things we can do to avoid those kinds of errors. Let's see, it looks like I have objects are not valid as React children. Okay. That's a pretty straightforward fix. Let's try. To turn it into a string, I believe. Yeah. So what I've got going on here, and thank you for being patient as we got to this point.
What you just changed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just did, and in fact, I think this is a bit cleaner. So this date command returns an object, but it was specifically this kind of interpolation that we were doing right here doesn't like objects. It's fine passing an object in as a prop, but we're kind of trying to like this is supposed to be text here, really. So that was the issue. So I guess what I just want to show here is that, what React does is whenever the value of a prop changes, React re-renders that element. Like when the argument passed to a function changes, we should execute that function again because we're going to get a new output, something new that gets rendered. And so I'm sort of doing this awkward wrapping of our root component here to demonstrate this. But I just wanted to show that like when a prop changes, React will re-render that component.
Did you get rid of that interval thing?
Say that again.
Did you get rid of the interval thing?
No, the interval's still there. I just moved it down because I have this stuff in the function definition.
I don't understand. Is this not using states at all? I guess that's where I'm kind
That
of
is correct. Yeah, we're not using states yet. That's going to be the next step. Exactly.
Okay, sorry. One more question then. So
Yeah.
if you go back to your code for just 1 second,
Yeah.
why does it matter? Like if on line 19, could you just do current time equals set interval get time the same? Is there any reason that you do it after like the definition, I guess?
Yeah, so the way I have it set up here, like, let me do this real quick. Let's see, we want all that stuff. I'm not going to try and do that. The short answer is no, we have to call set interval here. What we're doing is, so I need to force this prop to change. And so I kind of have to wrap this inside the function that's getting called right now for that. I don't want to go too much into that because mainly I just wanted to use this as an example of like a prop value that's changing. And then we're going to see kind of how to do this with state, which would make a lot more sense for this use case.
I guess my all-encompassing question is, I thought yesterday when we were doing this, Zainab had told us that if you don't use a state, like the HTML won't change. So I guess I'm just like confused how it's changing without the state.
Right. So when you change the value of a prop, React will re-render that component, meaning render new HTML. What we often do, and what we'll see in a minute, is we might have something be state like at one level of our component and then pass it in as a prop at another. When a component's state changes, React also re-renders. So if prop or state changes, then React will re-render that component.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but yeah, no, that's a really good question, for sure. For sure. And that's kind of the big thing, I think, that I kind of want to show. Like, and for example, if we didn't have the time here and we put it here, and let me wrap this in a div. And now I need to pass in a prop named current time. Let's see here, I have I did something wrong.
I think you have a typo in your current time when you're passing it in.
Oh, thank you. Oh yeah, I keep doing that. Thank you, Rex. So Yeah, and I think just for clarity, I think I'm going to get rid of these. There we go. So if we look in our app, and in fact, even better, if we look in components, you can see we've got hello world, we've got goodbye world, this prop gets passed in and is constantly changing. We could even watch here. It's constantly re-rendering this HTML. And note that React is smart enough not to re-render all these other HTML elements. So it does some checking for us. But yeah, like whenever a prop changes, React will check if it needs to re-render the component, if something has changed, or if state changes, it will check if it needs to re-render the component. And React here is really doing the work of updating the DOM for us. What other questions or thoughts do people have, or is there anything that I can go over again with this before we convert this into using state?
Well, I think you did a lot of like trying to show how it can display here and display here and display here kind of thing. But I think if we don't start kind of doing it the way you would normally do it, I might get confused as to where you're actually supposed to put stuff, because
Sure.
for some reason, mine's not doing what yours is doing, but that's because I didn't mess with my create root and stuff like that. And so I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who's kind of like a little bit behind here, but yeah, maybe if you could just get rid of the stuff that we don't need and put it where it's should be before we move on.
Sure, definitely. Yeah. I think honestly, the way to do that is to have this be state, because I think that is really, I would say,
like, I think I'm
the right
also
way to do
super
it.
confused, like that now when your main.jsx, you've got this function get time, which is also rendering our app.jsx. And I think all of that's just confusing me a bit, but that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And let's go ahead and let's move stuff around a little bit. Let's take this time stuff and let's put it in our main component, app.jsx. Let's get rid of get time. And let's get rid of set interval. And I believe this will work. Time is not defined. Time. Oh, because, right. So let's change this to be current time.
You forgot the T again.
Thank you. Line 7. Oh, I probably just need to. This is when you mess with main sometimes. Let's see what's going on here. Time is not defined. JSX 7 function app. Oh, I see. There we go. Okay, so this is, I think, similar to something that we've seen. right? We've simplified main. If this is exactly like it is, very similar to what it is by default. I have added these properties here. We don't need to have them there necessarily. The thing that's going to change time, we now have at the top level here in app. And we could do, let's see, set interval. Yeah, and this is where we need to start using state, really, because now it starts to get a little tricky. Dalton, yes.
Just real quick, and he put it in the chat too. I'm also kind of confused on it. Can you just briefly explain the difference between like what you're going to do with the app JSX and the main JSX?
Do you
Like,
mean what the difference is in general or right now?
Well, essentially, like, like, what if, like, am I ever going to use the main JSX or am I only using the app JSX? Like, I don't even know if that makes sense, but I guess I'm just confused, like, knowing where I'm going to put whatever.
Got it. Yeah, for now, we're going to put most of our stuff in app.jsx. Like, maybe like there will be a future point at which we'll want to do that, but for most of the stuff we'll be doing right now, we will be putting things we need to in app and we won't really be messing with main.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a good question. And I know that got a little confusing. So thank you for bringing that up. And a couple folks were talking about state and needing state. And so I think now is a good time to introduce that because we can't really do what we would want to do. Let's see, what does it not like about that?
Curly braces around use state.
Of course, thank you. Thank you. I think it looks something like this. I don't quite have that syntax right.
I think you need a T for that current time.
I do. I always forget that. That's not, the issue in the moment. I just,
Yeah, you're missing the opening bracket in front of set time.
Thank you. That time, right, because there's no, right. So. Would have thought. Let me make sure I have. Yep. Okay. Actually, we'll just call it. Time. There we go. Sorry about that. So a couple things. We're using state. You can give state a default value, which we're doing right there. And now we do have to update the time. And that's going to look something like this. Function update time.
Why was it already updating, or was it not? I thought it was.
Right. So before we had here that prop, right? Current time.
Oh.
And we had current time, and we had that interval, you know, that was kind of doing its thing. And because we were passing in a prop at the top level, React was re-rendering and checking if it needs to re-render. We're not passing in a prop at the top level, and we're not using an interval right now. I'm about to set that up actually. And it's going to look something like this. Let's see if that works. Yeah. Okay. So I just did a whole bunch of stuff there. So let's just walk through what happened. So just like we were doing before, we're setting an interval and we have this update. I just called it update time this time. And so every 1,000 seconds, this function update time gets called. We get the time, the date time as a string. And then we use React's state. And we talked, can someone maybe give like a 1,000-foot overview of state from yesterday? John, what do you recall from when we were talking about state yesterday?
So on line 7, you call the function useState and you pass the value now, which and then and you're to the left of that, you're creating two variables, time, which will take the value now when you call the function useState, and then set time, which useState creates, and it is a function that will set a new value for the time variable.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a couple pieces going on here, in fact. And in fact, what I'm going to do, let's pop back over here and put this here. Let's not even worry about passing state in as a prop. Yeah, and it's a pretty good description, John. Thank you. So yeah, React has this thing, they call it hooks. It's kind of their new way of doing things. The main thing is that, like, I want to find a nice React lifecycle diagram. Yeah, this one isn't perfect, but it'll do. So we're going to talk a little bit about React component lifecycle, which I'm sure folks talked about a little bit yesterday. Because this is what state is doing and what's happening with props. A component has 3 phases: mounting, updating, and unmounting. All the interesting stuff happens in the updating phase. And some of these we don't really have to worry about, especially with functional components. What really matters is here in the updating one. See these 3 things: new props, get state, force update. If props change, if state changes, or if we call this force update function, React will figure out if it needs to re-render the component. And we don't really have to worry about what this get derived state from props means. And this lifecycle phase, should component update, is pretty self-descriptive. It's React figuring out if it needs to re-render the component. And if it does, it renders the component again. And so it does that when state changes and when props change. And what we're doing right now is, because we have this interval and we're using it to change our state, this time state, every 1,000 seconds, and then we're rendering that change here, that's forcing React to re-render this component. Let's put that there. Every 1,000 seconds. And it's kind of cool because we can see that it's only changing what it needs to. And if we look over here in components, we can see that the state is changing. So this is kind of a key thing. And I know that the hooks are a little confusing. We're setting a variable and a function. And then React does the work of doing all the rendering. And I'm sure that we looked at something like this yesterday. So let me just pause and check in with folks and see if people have questions. And I know it was a little bit of a journey to get here, but does this look a bit more like kind of what we were seeing the other day? And what are people's thoughts?
Yes, it looks more like what we saw yesterday.
Yeah, totally.
Quick question. You
Yeah.
said that the React is re-rendering it because the use state changed, correct?
Yeah, the state changed. Use state is like, we can have different chunks of state, for example, like we can have as many pieces of state as we want using that use state hook. But yeah, please go on, John. Or was that Michael? I'm sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, so I was just making sure that I understood that the page is re-rendering the information because the state has changed, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, and then we can also then pass this state down as a prop. Sorry. And over here, let's grab this and put it in our hello world.
Hey, Adam, what script calls the render function?
Great question. You mean like when our page is re-rendering because state has changed?
Yeah, pretty much. Well, I guess before that, is there not do we never manually write render? Is that just something that happens?
That is exactly correct. The only time we manually call render is to render that very top level component. At that point on, React does all the work of deciding when to re-render components onto the page.
Okay, so it's not really something you have to think about as a developer. You just have to know what happens.
Correct. Yeah. And that's the advantage of React, because it does a lot of this work for us. And as we start adding more interactivity and things, it makes life easier. Yeah, our job is really to understand how React works and what causes it to re-render.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, no, good question. Very good question. Yeah, what other questions do people have? So I think something I want to point out is that this app component is re-rendering because its state is changing. This hello world component is re-rendering because its prop is changing. Like here, it doesn't have any state, but this time prop is constantly changing. And so that's causing it to re-render. And what we're doing is we create some state at a higher level and we pass it down as a prop to a child component at a lower level. So I just want to check in with folks and make sure that that makes sense to everyone and everyone feels good about that. Okay, awesome. Any questions? Okay.
Can you scroll up just a tiny bit?
Alicia, what's up?
Can you scroll up just a little bit?
Yep, for sure.
Okay. So I think the only part I'm getting a little bit, okay, so you have the update time, but you're never actually calling that function, right?
Set interval does that on line 14.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, for sure. No, it's a little tricky. And the reason we're using the interval here is just to give an example, but it's a good example. Like for instance, we might want to use Axios to make a call to our database to refresh a list every couple seconds, depending, you know, if I don't know, if we were looking at like stock market prices, for example, like that could be, it would be a pattern very similar to this one. If we wanted to like constantly like get the new stock, the price for a stock or something. Yeah, what other questions do people have?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so yesterday I think what I was running into with the homework was that I had one component that would do some logic,
Mm-hmm.
and then I wanted to pass the results of that logic to a different component. It wasn't necessarily a child component, but it was like, you know, just another component. Like, so for example, it would be like the input component passing information to a button component or something like that.
Yeah, totally.
And I thought, okay, I should be able to do this with props, but it doesn't seem like you can, right? Because it has to be a child component.
Yeah.
So is this just the wrong approach? Was I just taking the wrong approach trying to send information between components that aren't children components? Like, would I send that up to the app and then have the app set it as a prop, or, you know, how would you approach that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let's take a look at that. And in fact, we're kind of going there next. So great timing, Luis. Thank you. Let's say that we wanted to change the weather. And I wanted to have a button here. In fact, let's build it here and then we'll move it. So let's say that we're going to change the weather. And so let's create some state. And the weather is initially going to be sunny. Oh, where do I? Yep. Okay, we'll just get rid of that, in fact. I'm going to double check and make sure that everything's working. Cool. And let's create an update weather function. It's going to be really simple. If weather equals sunny, set weather cloudy. Else. So basically, this flips weather from sunny to cloudy. There's probably a nicer way to write that, but its basic idea is if the weather's already sunny, we make it cloudy. If the weather's not sunny, it's got to be cloudy, so let's make it sunny. And let's create a button and have it call this function. And let's put it here. Button change weather. I believe we can do on click update weather. Let's see if this works. So I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah, you misspelled on click.
Oh yeah, thank you. Oh, and I did it again. Let me get rid of, bless you. Let me get rid of those console log statements. Let me see where they're hiding, because I think we don't need that anymore. Okay, awesome. There we go. And now we can change our weather. Does everyone feel good about how we're doing that right now with state? Because this is a big thing too.
Could you just walk through how you did that again?
Yeah, Meredith, totally. So, and in a lot of ways, the way to start is, let's start with that design. We want to be able to change the weather. So first, I add a button to change the weather. And right now, it can't do anything. So let's add an, using its onClick property, let's add an update weather function. And I'm going to kind of move backwards in time and just rewrite this, which I think will be great. I'm going to and so now I've got my button and it's working, but it's just console logging. And the next step would be to create some state. And I left that in there because we're using this in a couple places and it would break stuff. And React's use state hook, it returns an array. And the first thing in the array is always the value of this little slice of state that we've created. And it's set to sunny by default. And then the second value is a function that we can use to change it. So here we can do set weather if weather is sunny, set weather to be cloudy. Otherwise, set the weather to be sunny. And now, does that make sense, Meredith? And again, the magic is React. because what React does is it's watching state when we create state. And so if it changes, it checks if it has to re-render that component for it to be up to date, and it does. So it does that work for us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, and this is a lot of stuff. So thank you for asking, and everyone, thank you for asking, because we're covering a lot of ground. Yeah, what other questions do people have around the way that we're using state right now with this button? And note too that my update function is actually using state too. We're checking the current value of the state and modifying it based on what it is. Okay, cool. And then Luis, your question was, well, what if I don't want to update my weather here in this app? What if I want to do it maybe in our goodbye world or our hello, our goodbye world component? Maybe we want this button to go over here. But I kind of want my weather information to stay up here because I need to pass it into this hello world component too. So I need my state to stay up here, but I have to pass in the state and the ability to change the state into this other prop. So what we can do would look something like this. And then let's take this function, update weather. And let's just put it here. And so what I did, just to recap, we still have our state up here in the app, weather and set weather. I'm passing in that state and the function to update that state as props. And this is and Luis, I think this is kind of what you might have been wondering about. And I'll check in with you in a minute too. But this is a huge thing with React. Like we can pass in a function as a prop, and that's hugely powerful because that lets us move our state and like the logic around our state up to a higher level where we can pass it down into different children. And so here as props, we've got weather, and we've got props dot set weather. And in fact, what I'll do is I'm going to do this. Set weather equals props dot set weather, just to make life a little easier. And I think this will work. Let's see. Oh, weather is not defined. Oh, because, yep, because I do it here. Okay, so we'll actually do this. Have you folks seen this notation? Has anyone seen this before?
Deconstructor?
Yeah, it's an object deconstructor. So I'm going to introduce this because this is all over the place with React. This is JavaScript. I can do this, right? I could do set weather, and then what do I have? Prefix. And then like over here, I don't have to say props.prefix. I don't have to say props.weather. And it makes my code a little nicer. It makes it easier for me to move stuff around between files like we just saw.
Before you erase all of that and show us the with Deconstructor, could you instead comment it and then just add a line? We can do all of this with this Deconstructor.
Yeah, that's a great call. Thank you, Alicia. I will totally do that. Yeah, that's a really good call. Thank you. Yeah, because in JavaScript, we're working with objects and their properties so much. The committee that defines JavaScript added a language feature called deconstruction, object deconstruction. And what this does is it grabs these keys that have to exist on the object and does exactly this. This is exactly what it's doing under the hood. So it's a little bit of a shorthand that we can use. There's also array deconstruction, by the way. Like if I have an array, I can grab the first and second elements out of that array. And that's actually what is going on in a hook. UseState returns an array, and we're using array deconstruction to set and define those variables, which I personally find they probably had reasons to do it, but in fact, they do because it lets us name it whatever we want. I think that's why they did it that way. But it is a little confusing. So yeah, let's see if this is working. Because I think I was running into an issue. Okay, and now this is working. And if we look over here, and if we look at goodbye world, we don't really know the details, but we can see this set weather prop is some kind of function, right? Without it involving setting state, in fact. And this is a super common pattern with React. So I figured that this is a good time to pause and check in with people. And Luis, is this kind of what you were asking about?
Yeah, well, it sort of was, yeah. Except, so the only difference is that by world to have its own state. Like, so for example, I expected, imagine goodbye world is called like weather widget or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're getting weather data from like some kind of API.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't the weather widget itself have the state for that component? And then it just seems odd to me that we're putting all of the component states in app.jsx. Is that the way it's going to be for everything? Like, are we just going to?
Right. Yeah. So there are a couple reasons why we do this. And in fact, like, let me show, like, well, I don't want to change any code. But we often do put state at a higher level, and we do it for two reasons. One is that sometimes we need to access state in different places in our React app. Like here, we need to get weather for hello world and goodbye world. And so if the state only existed here, there's not a React friendly way to get that information to hello world, to its sibling component, because they're siblings. With React, it's really easy to pass state down as a prop to a child. So that's the main reason here why we want this weather information to be in the state for the app component, so we can pass it into these two siblings. There will often be times where goodbye world might have some other information, or if this was the only component that needed that state information, that we could do everything just in there. But when you need to pass information around between components, that's usually when you end up lifting it up to a higher level, to a parent component in the app. Does that help a little?
I would add that it's not always going to be in the app component. So if you had a weather component, like you were saying, so the weather component would probably be in the app component. So app wouldn't have the state. The state would be inside the weather component, because that's the only part that you care about. And then your hello world, goodbye world would probably be inside the weather component, because they need access to that.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, I think a great example of that would be, let's take this time bit and factor it out. Because like we've got time here, and we show the time here, and we show the time here in hello world. But let's pretend that like we're always going to display the time the same way. And someone also had a question. I saw someone with their hand up and I missed them, so I just want to check in actually before diving into this. Who there was someone with their hand up. I think it was Caleb actually.
Yeah, I was just asking about a question with deconstructors. Do you have to specify every one of the key values, or just the ones that you want to use?
That's a great question. You only have to specify the ones you want to use.
Okay.
Yeah, really good question. Like if we weren't using prefix, we could get rid of it and it would work fine. And that's part of the power of it. Yeah, really good question. Thank you. Yeah, other questions. And I think someone was about to say something. Okay, cool. Let me go ahead and let's refactor, and let's kind of, Zainab, I'm going to kind of run with what you're saying and show how we might want to change our component to sort of encapsulate stuff like that. Like if we look at our app, you know, we have these two time messages, we have these two weather messages. We probably want different components for hello world and goodbye world because they have different things to say. You know, you could imagine for a real app, there's more stuff going on. But the point being is we need to take that weather data and render it differently. For the time, we're pretty much doing the same thing. So maybe we can encapsulate that all into one component and use that component in different places. And that was, I think, a really good point that people were making. And I want to go ahead and do that right now. React. So what I'm going to do first, we're going to use state in a minute, but I'm just writing a dumb component that just renders something. And wherever we want time information, I'm going to use this new time component that I'm creating, and I need to export it too. I really should rename it current time. So I'm going to do that too, because time is a little too vague. And I'm going to rename the file. Rename to current time. Beautiful. So we've got this current time component, and we're going to use it here. Make sure that it's working. And
You put one too many T's in your current time when you imported it.
thank you. There we go. Beautiful. We got our fake time. And then over here, where we're displaying time, let's do the same thing. Why we need to display the current time in two places on the same page. You know, this is like if we had different pages, this would make a lot more sense. But hopefully the example should be useful. So we've got our new component now, but we don't have any time in it yet. And we already did all this work. So I'm just going to kind of copy what we did. And the key pieces are the bit of state we have for time and our update function and the interval. So I'm going to copy them over one by one. And put that stuff there. And knock on wood, this is going to work for us. Let's see what we've got going on now. That's not quite right. I'm probably still, oh yeah, we don't need that anymore. Let's see where this other error is. Now is not defined in current time. Oh, let's see. I missed that. We don't even really need that, to be honest, but it's nice to give it an initial value. Okay, awesome. So we've just actually done a very nice refactor to our application now. That's a great example of kind of how to do things the React way, and is sort of similar to what you were talking about, Luis, too. We have functionality and view, like rendering logic. We have logic and presentation together in the same component. And that's kind of the power of React. Like we have a bit of logic to get the current time. And then here we render the current time. And then just like with the template, I can change how we render that or whatever we need to do with that. And then everywhere in our application where we're using that component gets updated. And it's totally self-contained. So now's a good time, I think, to check in and see what questions people have and if that makes sense to folks. Okay, awesome. I think the last thing I'm going to do is maybe introduce a little bit of conditional logic. I think for hello world, it should only display a message if the weather is sunny. Otherwise, it should display it shouldn't display anything. And there are a lot of different ways to do conditional logic. There are some like things that you can do with JavaScript to reduce code duplication. Simple is a great way to start. Let's see if that works. Awesome. And now we've got some cool conditional logic. Let's do the same thing for goodbye world. However, I've run into
You
a
have to have
problem
that
now.
function there too.
Say that again, Alicia.
You have to have that update weather there too. I thought you didn't have a button on that page.
Oh, this update weather button?
Line 12. Oh, you do have a button there.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I didn't
Yeah.
see. Sorry.
And that's actually a problem that we've just run into, which is that we kind of want this conditional logic to say, hey, we only want to say goodbye world when it's cloudy, but I have my button in here and then it gets hidden. So we need to either add more logic here or do some composition to kind of change our React component architecture. And I think this is the last thing we'll do, and then we'll probably break for lunch, and we might do thinking in React for maybe 45 minutes after lunch. But this is a great example, actually. And this is like, React is all about what it calls composition. And we're starting to see it. We can see it here, how we have hello world and goodbye world, and we broke out current time into its own component with view and logic encapsulated, and how like our top level component, in a lot of ways, its job is to hold global state that we care about, and how we can pass that state in as prompts. And so I think now this is a perfect time to break out our change weather button into its own component too. And then we can put it wherever we want. And I think it might make sense to put it up here at the top level so that it's always visible. So I'm going to do that in 2 steps. I'm going to create the new component, and then I'm going to move the code in piece by piece. So I'm just going to create a file. I'm just going to call it change weather. And we're going to need, yeah, I don't remember if we'll need use state. We'll get there. It's going to be a button. And just like I did before, I'm going to start just with the view logic. I could have copied that over, from there, but it's just a button, so it's not too much.
Adam, before you go into this, I just want to make sure I'm tracking what's going on.
Yeah,
I think you were
absolutely.
saying there was an error because in your if statement, your button was in your if statement, so it
Yep.
wasn't even registering because it starts out as sunny.
Yep.
And so now you're making a component to change the weather, and then the goodbye and the hello world will just access. They won't need to set the weather anymore. They'll just access essentially the weather, the result of that, right?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. In goodbye world specifically, we had our change weather button, and now that gets hidden whenever the weather is sunny. And we could do this, to be completely honest. There's no reason, like, this would actually be step 1. And actually, if I was at work, this would be the correct step 1. And we might not even ever get to step 2 because like maybe we only need this button in 2 places. But now our change weather button is always there. And actually, when you folks are developing, I think this is a really good step 1. And then step 2 is, the rule of thumb is sort of, if you have the same code in like 3 or more than 3 places, then it's time to kind of refactor it into its own thing. Here we're only using it twice, but for learning purposes, it's, I think, a really good example. So what I'm gonna do is I've got this new change weather button and I'm gonna put it where I want it. I think I want it here. And did that make sense, Alicia?
Yep.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, that was a really good question. It was really good to go over that too, I think, for everyone. And we've got the old one and the new one. And just in fact, just so we can tell them apart, I'm going to capitalize everything in the new one. There we go. And so I know that's my new button and that's my old button, and the new one doesn't do anything yet. And now let's move stuff over piece by piece from the old one. So we're going to need this update weather function. And we'll put that there.
Sorry, Adam, I'm confused. Where did you just pass in your button? Like you didn't put it in the app file, right?
Yeah, so I added this change weather button. I did add that new change weather component to the app file.
What? Oh, so then where's the, did you delete that? I guess maybe I didn't see you do that. Did you take that out of your app file?
Right. So
It's just changing all the change weather functionality into its own component. And then the goodbye world and hello world will just render an HTML element based on the state of weather.
yeah, let me go back there. Sorry that I'm jumping around a bit. Let's see if that got us. Yeah, so this is what we currently have going on. And that change weather button is in goodbye world. What I want to do is I want to move it here into app.js. And I did create this new component called change weather. And right now it's just a button that does nothing. And what I was going to do next is I did want to add it here at the top level to app.js. Just really because I find the visual aid useful. So now we have two buttons, the old one that we're going to shift over and get rid of, and the new one. Does that make sense, Dalton?
Yeah, I think I might just have to let you keep going because I thought the whole point of putting change weather in the app is so that you could use the props that you're already passing in, but maybe I'm just confused on something.
Right. Well, we are going to pass in a prop. We do need to pass in this set weather prop. And we actually need to pass in the weather as well. We're not doing anything with them yet here, but we are going to use them.
Okay.
Yeah, we have this logic right now in that goodbye world component that to flip the weather, and yeah, basically this flip weather logic.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And this is what I want to grab now. So actually, I'm going to get rid of the button from here. I'm going to grab this logic and move it over. And if we wanted to, by the way, we could even put the change weather logic up here in app.js. And that's really more of a design decision. And we can kind of look at that in a moment, actually, because there is one advantage to that, which we can talk about in a minute. We're going to use object deconstruction to get weather and set weather from props. And I think, let's see, I probably, I haven't hooked up the button. That would be the last bit. Update weather. And now we've got this change weather button. So, I mean, you raise a good point, Dalton. Like at this point, do we really need another component for change weather? You know, not necessarily if it's going to live up here. The advantage of this now is it does become like very easy to move it around. Like if we did want change weather in one of these components, it's pretty straightforward to add. And in fact, I would argue, well, I'm not going to get into that. We could move this update function up to the top level to app 2, and then make this button like even simpler. But I think that's getting into the weeds a little bit.
But just to be clear, set weather is not a component itself, right? That is just the function in your use state.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. We create the state up here at the top level of app.js, and then we're passing that set weather function in here.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
For sure. Oh, and we don't need it there anymore, so we can get rid of that. Everything should be working. Yeah, what other questions do people have?
Could I look at change weather real quick?
Yeah, for sure. What's on your mind, Luis? And I
To look at it.
got it.
All right, now that I'm looking at this file, I guess I'm also starting to realize, so what is the, like, I thought the only time you made a JSX file is to make a component, correct?
That is correct.
Oh, but this is set weather, not change. Okay, I think I was just getting confused in the name, sorry.
No, no worries. Yeah, I'm using the same names from state.
Did we have an update weather function in app.js? Did we have it somewhere else? Did we just repeat that?
So it used to live here in Goodbye World. It might have even lived in app.js at one point, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, what we can even do, and this is the refactor I was thinking about showing folks, we could move that update weather function up here. And then for change weather, all it needs is an update weather function. And I think that, let's see, what did I get wrong here? Oh, that works. Yeah, and let me recap that refactor that I made real quick. So I took the update weather logic that we had in our change weather component. I moved it up to the top level, where we also have the state that it needs to access and modify. So it's all in one place. And then this is sort of like you'll often see like handle change weather. These kind of like on-click functions named with handle or like something like that. And now this function encapsulates all the logic that we need to change the weather. And I can pass that function in as a prop to my change weather button. And then we can change the weather. And it is a little contrived because at this point, you know, all we need here is a button. But again, hopefully it's a good example of like how you can like arrange things and how maybe if we had more sophisticated behavior going on, like if we needed, when you clicked on this button, there needed to be a spinner, for example, while something was happening, or it had error states or displaying other messages, then how we can kind of encapsulate some of that stuff and keep state at like a higher level in the app. Yeah, in a lot of ways, you could even like write a hook to handle updating weather. That's a little outside the scope of what we've been looking at. So there's just different approaches. The other approach is fine too. Here now we only have to pass one prop in to change weather as opposed to two when we were passing weather and set weather before. So that's sort of the small advantage. But I think the main thing is to start getting a feel for how we can compose components and how that lets us move stuff around and re-architect stuff and reuse logic, and how often we'll want to move our state and maybe some of the logic around our state up to a higher level if it's used in multiple places in our application. Jacob, yes, sir.
My question is about the current time.jsx file. So could you just maybe talk a little bit about like what the on line 4 where it says now equals, what is like the new doing, and then
totally. And this is a little funny. So let me just show what that looks like in plain JavaScript, which I think will help a lot. So JavaScript, it does have a new operator, and it does have, I hate to call date a class, but in JavaScript, I can do new date, and that returns an object actually. My date dot. So it's an object, and it has a property toLocale string, which will return the date set for the correct time zone based on server information. So new date. So that's just the JavaScript new keyword, and then the JavaScript built-in date. Again, I hate to call it a class, but class.
Okay, so
It's
that's
more
not
like
even
a function
something
or object.
exclusive to React. Like we could use
exactly.
new date in like any
Exactly. We can do it here in the console.
Okay, cool. I did not know that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a really good question, man. Thank you. And I think that's one of the challenges just when learning this stuff, because there is a lot of stuff. And with JSX in particular, it can get confusing if something's React or JavaScript. So definitely please asking questions like that, folks, because I think it's super helpful to nail that distinction down early on. Like, what is JavaScript doing and what is React doing?
And then one other question. Couldn't you just do, why are you doing toLocale string? Like, if you're just trying to make it into a string, why not just like toString?
Yeah, great question. I don't know if JavaScript has a built-in toString method the way Python does. And even if it does with this date object, I'm not sure exactly what we would get. Like, let me console.log.
You can just do toString and see what it'll show us.
That's a good call. Let's see what happens.
That is the JavaScript, I think.
Okay, so that actually would work too. I think I just saw that from an example. Locale string, either one works perfectly fine for our purposes. Locale string tries to figure out your time zone based on like if we've set that information in our JavaScript application, I believe. But either one works perfectly fine.
Okay, cool. That clears things up. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you, Jacob. Yeah, no, those are good questions. Because I did just throw toLocale string in the mix without really talking about it. So thank you again. Yeah, why don't we break for lunch? And then we can come back at 1:30. I think I want to spend 30 minutes going through the thinking in React kind of walkthrough on Facebook. I think it'll be really helpful for folks, and it touches on kind of how to break something down into pieces and how to build that, which I know we didn't quite get into as much this morning. I think this morning was really good on some of the React fundamentals that I think will be helpful. And then hopefully that 30 minutes will really help you in seeing, all right, here's how I can use this stuff now to like build some of the things for our homework assignments and projects and things like that. So I think that's the plan. All right, folks, thank you. Have a good lunch. Does 1:30 make sense to you, Raphael, and to you, Zainab?
Maybe give him a few more minutes. It's
Yeah,
almost
so-
12:30 now. I think 2 o'clock is good.
Okay, yeah, let's do 2. We'll do 2, and then maybe I'll have, thinking in React can be optional because we also have a little less time in the afternoon. Because of there's the guest speaker, so we can check in and see where people are at.
All right.
Yeah, cool. 2 o'clock. Thank you, everyone.